Make sure you guys hit the subscribe button if you guys are enjoying the content that we're throwing up, and make sure you guys hit the like button if you enjoy the video, and yeah, let's begin. What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and I want to cover the current run of the Eternals. We're only about 3 issues in, and it's a monthly series, so it's one comic every month. So it'll probably be kind of a slow-going thing, but the story's really cool so far, and I'm curious to see how you guys would respond to it. But one of the things this does is this basically opens up with Ikaris essentially being revived. Now, to give you guys a little bit of context here, and this is exceedingly important, we go more in-depth into this in our Eternals Explained video, so make sure you check that out. It'll be linked down in the description. But the whole point behind this is that the Eternals originally believed that their modus operandi, right, the reason why they existed in the first place, is because the Celestials had appeared on Earth and they had basically modified the genes of early man, and part of that modification resulted in the Eternals. But the Eternals existed to basically kind of safeguard humanity, to guide humanity, because that was part of the Celestial experiment, and the idea was that the genes of a portion of early man had been modified so that in the future they would develop powers. And so the Eternals essentially protected humanity from the Deviants, and so that's why the Eternals and the Deviants were always at war. The thing that kind of leads into this, and the story that really kind of gives us the explanation for why Ikaris is being revived in the first place, came in all new, all different Avengers. And this was basically the revelation of the Dark Celestials. Now, that story built on a previous story, but the two kind of go hand in hand. And the complete kind of event that was given to us here was that the reality of the Eternals' existence was to basically be like a lid on a petri dish, right? That the truth about the Celestial experiment was that every planet they visit and every planet they experiment on will be destroyed, right? It's only a matter of time before it is. And the way this works is you have the Celestials and then you have the Horde. And the Celestials kind of represent absolute good, so to speak. And that's a loose term that I use, but it's the closest we get if we compare it to like morality in comparison to what Jack Kirby originally wanted to do with the Eternals in the old stories he did back in 1976. And then the Horde kind of represent absolute evil. And the energies of both of these groups are fed on by a being called the Fulcrum. And so the way this works is that when an experiment is conducted on a planet by the Celestials, a portion of those genes are modified so that at a future point in time, they'll develop powers. Hence the reason you get mutants in Marvel Comics. After some predated amount of time, which is described as 19 cycles, I don't know how that compares to real world time, then what happens is the Celestials go back and then they basically harvest the planet. And if the energy of that planet matches the energy signal of the Deviants, then all the energy of that planet goes to the Horde, which is just kind of like an evil group that exists out there. If the energy of that planet matches the energy of the Eternals, then it goes to the Celestials. And so it was a way to kind of maintain this balance between the Celestials and the Horde. Quite literally, they're vying for energy based on a particular planet. What this meant is the Eternals learned the truth of their existence. So they were basically just kind of security guards, just keeping humanity safe so it could be harvested at a future point in time. And even the Eternals themselves would be harvested at a future point in time. This basically led to the Eternals going insane and then killing each other, right? They just went nuts. Like, and some of them committed suicide. Most of them just took each other out, right? It was just like this insane level of existential crises that they just couldn't handle. And so the result is it was Marvel's way of just kind of killing off all the Eternals, just sort of stripping them from the entirety of the Marvel landscape, and presumably doing so they could reboot them at a future point in time, right? This was done less than a decade ago, and so I have to believe that Marvel was kind of gearing up for the possibility of them doing an Eternals film and just kind of setting the stage so they could bring them back adequately. And that's what happens here. And so the result of this is you end up having Ikaris, who is essentially kind of resurrected in what's called the Exclusion Zone. Now, the Exclusion Zone serves a couple different purposes in the Eternals mythos. The first purpose is that when an Eternal dies, if a resurrection is going to happen, they resurrect them there. The second thing is that it serves as a prison. So if there is an Eternal that defects from the cause, right? If the Eternals are there to protect humanity and an Eternal comes along and says, no, we should enslave humanity, and then like goes on a campaign to kill as many humans as they can, they'll be locked away in the Exclusion. And they'll be left there until such a time as they either repent and understand the error of their ways and go forward as a proper Celestial, or they'll stay there until the end of all things, right? Presumably until like the world's destroyed or the Celestials cull the Eternals or whatever the case happens to be. In this instance, it's where Ikaris is being resurrected. Now, when he comes back, he actually ends up coming across Zuros, and Zuros is now currently the Prime Eternal. And one of the things they talk about here is the idea of the One Mind. The One Mind is basically the Unimind, and kind of a quick synopsis or a quick explanation, again, based on what we talked about in our Eternals Explained video. The Unimind is basically when the Eternals come together and quite literally combine their minds and energy to create a singular gestalt energy source that basically makes decisions. It can also be used as as a weapon, right? Like if a threat is dire enough, the Unimind can be formed, which is like the collective energy of all the Eternals, and is quite powerful in its own right. And so the decision was more or less made because Ikaris is the last person to return. Ikaris was previously the Prime Eternal, or the leader of the Eternals. Because he was the last to die, he's the last to be resurrected. And that in that time frame, the Unimind was formed, and Zuros was chosen to be the leader. Now, in my mind, it always should have been Zuros who was the Prime Eternal, and the reason why is because he's one of the oldest Eternals in existence. And in fact, I think him, outside of Alars, he is the oldest one. He's the oldest son of Kronos. But in effect, he's a second generation Eternal, more or less. And the reason why I say that matters is because given the history of the Eternals, if you guys check out my video on the Eternals Explained, that we basically talked about this idea that when they were first created by the Celestials, that what you had here was Kronos and Uranos. And Uranos incited conflict. He incited a civil war against the Eternals, and then in turn, he incited a civil war among the Eternals, which of course led to Uranos being defeated. Ultimately, he was cast off of Earth, and then eventually settled on Saturn's moon Titan, and then of course there was a great big huge civil war among those individuals. But Kronos had two sons on Earth. The first was Zuros, and the second was Alars. Alars, as you guys know, eventually went to Titan following the deaths of Uranos and his forces. He married Suisan, they had a couple kids. One was Eros, also known as Star Fox. The other was Dion, also known as Thanos. I never agreed with Marvel changing the name of Thanos to Dion. But the important thing here is that Zuros remained on Earth. And so as essentially the oldest Eternal, he always should have been the one to lead. I think in the end, Marvel basically chose Ikaris just because of his popularity among comic book readers, but it makes sense that it would be Zuros here. And so it's one of those things that doesn't necessarily sit well with Ikaris, but I think, again, it's a good call because Ikaris is kind of headstrong, right? He's very brusque. He's not much in the way of a leadership style in terms of his personality. But at the end of the day, the choice was made and he simply has to follow it. And that's one of the things that's established here. When the Unimind makes a choice, the choice is made, and that's it. There's no arguing against that. If Ikaris were to go to Zuros and say, no, you do not need to be the leader of the Eternals, I should be the leader of the Eternals, he'd be cast away to the exclusion zone. Because in effect, he's committing heresy against the Prime Eternal. And so again, it's just one of those things that he just kind of has to deal with. Now, in the midst of that, of course, as he's kind of traversing around and figuring out what's going on here, he ends up coming across Sprite. This is one of the funny things that Marvel Comics did. So the idea behind this is that Sprite was originally a guy. Marvel switched him up to a girl. I'm sure there'll be comic book fans who are going to be mad about it. I don't really know why. It's not like they could give me the history of Sprite without looking up a Wikipedia article in the first place. So they're basically mad about something they don't really know anything about. But at the end of the day, I think it's kind of a funny little thing, right? It's kind of a cool little maneuver. And there's actually a reason why this happens. But the problem with Sprite is basically the Eternals version of Loki. That's really what she is. Sprite causes problems, right? Sprite is just kind of a prankster, a trickster. There was one point where Sprite actually wiped the minds of all the Eternals, so it was kind of nuts in terms of how all that happened. But that's kind of a cat and mouse game that Sprite always plays with Ikaris and the other Eternals, which is pulling pranks. They track down Sprite. Sprite maybe gets a little bit of a stern talking to or a slap on the wrist, and it kind of goes on, right? It's just sort of par for the course when it comes to the character. The biggest issue with this is that as Ikaris is chasing down Sprite and kind of playing this little cat and mouse game, Sprite teleports to New York City. And when Sprite gets there, suddenly everything is brand new. Now, a lot of this is because of the fact that Sprite has more or less been backed up from a previous memory that Sprite had. The result of this is that while Sprite has experienced all this before, the idea of humanity in its current form is known to Sprite. Sprite doesn't remember, right? Just because of the fact that again, the memories that she has here are from before she had essentially encountered any of the regular Earthlings in their current form. And so, by all standards of measurement, it's a whole new experience, and it's awesome. Because Sprite's like, look at the things that they've achieved. This is awesome. You know, this is cool. But it's also kind of Ikaris catching up Sprite on a little bit of her history and saying, like, you have kind of caused problems in the past, and like, you literally tried to kill us all. Now, in the midst of this, they're met by the arrival of Iron Man. And this is a cool little moment here for a couple different reasons. One, Iron Man and Ikaris have met so many times in Marvel Comics. This is not a new thing, right? It's not a brand new concept, but it's kind of cool because like Iron Man asks, like, are you gonna freak out again? And again, this ties into the deaths of the Eternals. And the reason for that is because with everything going on regarding the Dark Celestials, that Iron Man and Doctor Strange had actually sought out the Eternals because they regularly commune with the Celestials. If there's anyone on Earth who's an authority on the Celestials, it is the Eternals, right? They know each other intimately. And so the result of this is that the last time Iron Man saw Ikaris, he was freaking out and like all the Eternals were killing each other. And so that's why it's kind of like, are you gonna kill each other again? You know, is that what's gonna happen? You know, it's like, no, we're good, man. And so it's kind of a funny little thing. And so ultimately Iron Man's like, okay, cool. By the way, man, give my number to Cersei, you know, because like she's kind of hot. And it's weird, right? Like it's a little weird. Like Iron Man's trying to get with a woman who's something like 10,000 years old or something along those lines. Probably older than that, maybe closer to like 20,000. We don't get a definitive date on how old Cersei is, but like she's old. Now, in the midst of all this, essentially excess deviation is detected by Ikaris. And the result is he and Sprite have to respond to it. Now, what's excess deviation? So the Eternals are constantly at war with the Deviants. They're always at war. And it's almost kind of like an internal alarm system to a degree, in the sense that if Deviants are in proximity, Eternals will pick up on it, and the Eternals will go and attack Deviants, but only under the condition that Deviants are essentially doing what they're not supposed to be doing. In this instance, a Deviant's captured a human being. Under normal circumstances, the kind of rule, the unofficial rule between the Eternals and the Deviants is you stay away, we stay away, right? So you guys stay down there in the underground and you do your thing, and we'll stay up here, but as soon as you guys step out of line, boom, we're there, right? And we'll put you guys right back in check again. We'll kill whoever we have to in the process. And it's almost kind of a sport, right? It's almost one of these things where it's just kind of like, okay, like, you know, this kind of narrative that's given is like, for Ikaris, it would be a fight, right? For Sprite, it would be a game. But for them, but because it's something that they've always done, right? Like when Deviants deviate, Eternals correct. It's one of these things where it's like we lust for the chance to fight Deviants, right? It's just what they do. So like, that's one of the reasons why you kind of notice that the trickster nature of Sprite suddenly vanishes, and it's like, okay, now it's time to kill some Deviants. And like, it's a cool thing, right? Because ultimately they end up taking this Deviant out and they save the human being, and then they take him back to the surface. And of course, they end up going back to Olympia. Now, Olympia is the capital city, and the reason why it's called that, because you would probably immediately associate this with the Greek god home of Olympus. This actually happened in the very early days. So the Eternals, following their creation, began to come to the realization that gods like Zeus and Hera, Athena, Apollo, Aphrodite, that they were basically meddling in the affairs of humanity. And while the job of the Eternals was to essentially guide and protect humanity, with them realizing what was going on, there wasn't enough going on there for them to like get involved, in the sense that like the Greek gods weren't just indiscriminately killing humans. They weren't really a credible threat to humanity. It was really more of them just kind of getting involved in humanity, right? So like Zeus running around and banging girls, right? And like Aphrodite banging dudes, right? That was essentially it, right? And so they took a passing curiosity. Eventually, a kind of alliance formed between the two groups, if for no other reason than the fact that one, they both operated on Earth, and two, the Eternals wanted to keep a closer eye on the Greek gods. Eventually, they became more allies than enemies or anything like that, but it's one of these kind of interesting instances where the Eternals sort of allied themselves more with one group than another, because you never really saw the Eternals spending a lot of time on Asgard and hanging out with like Odin and Loki and Thor and those kind of guys, largely because Asgard's in its own pocket dimension outside of Earth, so you literally have to leave Earth and travel to a different dimension to get to it. But nonetheless, it's one of these kind of interesting situations, because once they arrive there, because Sprite is effectively meeting Zuros for the very first time, or at least the first time since Sprite's return, it's kind of one of those things of, hey, like make sure you pay proper respect when you get to the Prime Eternal. The problem with this is they come across Phastos. Phastos, of course, being somebody who's not really a pacifist, but he's not really huge on war, but is really more of just like the technology guy, the Eternals, who essentially reveals that Zuros has been killed, right? Somebody killed Zuros. They effectively teleported in and teleported out. But the crazy thing about this is, despite Eternals being nearly invulnerable and being exceedingly difficult to kill, somebody crushed the head of Zuros with their bare hands. And that's why it's like, okay, who in the hell did this, right? Like, who in the world could have done this? Now, at this point, you get to Druid. Druid is just kind of a dick, and at one point was an enemy of the Eternals, like their main foe. But it's one of these things where initially the question is like, could it have been Sprite? But immediately people are just kind of like, no. Like, one, Sprite's not strong enough to do that. And two, while Sprite causes problems, I mean, Sprite wouldn't kill the Prime Eternal, would she? But Druid actually pinpoints directly to Ikaris, and is like, Ikaris was the previous Prime Eternal, and Ikaris, last I saw, was none too happy about the fact that the Unimind determined that Zuros would be the new Prime Eternal. This guy's got motive, he's got strength, he's got the ability to pull it off. Ikaris at that point just headbutts the hell out of Druid, and it's just like, that's ridiculous, and then effectively just leaves. Now at this point, it's on the hunt for the person who did this, right? And so what they end up doing is basically teleporting to Titanos, the fallen capital of the Eternals. Now Titanos was the original capital of the Eternals. That's why it's considered fallen. It's more or less been an abandoned place. But once they get there, there's this kind of hunting around. There's this almost kind of excess deviation that's really felt by Ikaris, but not quite. But at the end of the day, the question is, okay, this energy source that we've traced to this location, who has in effect like destroyed whatever Eternals were left here, there has to be something going on. And ultimately you end up having this kind of vision that's given to Ikaris of some kid named Toby Robson, who ultimately ends up dying at 13 years old. And so it's kind of like, who in the world is this kid? And the response of Ikaris is, I don't know this kid. I've never met this kid, but at the end of the day, he's going to live. I'm going to save him. And that's when you get this kind of disembodied voice that says, more eternal blasphemy, an affront against the universe. All that live must die. When I'm done, there will be but a single thing that is eternal, and that thing will be death. The person who teleported to the Eternal base of operations, killed Zuros, then teleported here to Titanos and killed all the remaining Eternals here, is Thanos. Thanos is literally going to do everything he can to wipe out every Eternal from existence. Why he's going to do that, we don't know. But with that being said, guys, we're going to bring this to an end. With that being said, guys, we're going to bring this video to an end. Let me know what you think down in the comment section, and I will catch you all later. Peace.